Angela had always lived a quiet life. She worked long hours as a maid in the enormous mansion of billionaire Richard Vaughan, a man known across the city for his wealth, power, and ruthless business sense. The mansion stood on a hilltop, with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and wide gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Angela often admired the beauty around her, but it never belonged to her. She was only there to dust the shelves, polish the silver, and make sure every room looked perfect before Richard returned home. She was used to being invisible. Most of the time, Richard walked past her as if she were part of the furniture. If she spoke, he rarely responded. If she made an effort, he never noticed. Still, Angela carried out her duties with pride. She came from a family that believed honest work had its own dignity, no matter what job it was. Every day she rose before dawn, put on her simple uniform, and caught the early bus into the wealthy part of town, where the mansion gleamed like a palace. Angela had dreams once. She had gone to college for finance, sitting in classes where professors spoke of stocks, markets, and investments. She had loved the subject, and she had excelled at it. But her life had not been easy. When her father fell ill, she dropped out to help pay for medical bills. The part-time job she took as a maid turned into a permanent role. She thought it would be temporary, but months turned into years. She never told anyone about her unfinished studies or her talent for numbers. To everyone around her, she was simply a maid, someone who swept floors and washed windows. One evening, after a long day, Angela carefully set the dining table with fine china. The glasses sparkled under the golden light of the chandelier. She adjusted every detail, making sure it was perfect. Richard arrived home in a sharp suit, his phone pressed against his ear, barking orders to someone on the other end. His footsteps echoed through the hall, fast and impatient. Angela stepped aside, lowering her gaze the way she always did. But that night, fate tested her patience. As she reached to place the last glass, her hand trembled slightly. The stem of the wine glass slipped through her fingers, and the fragile piece fell to the floor. It shattered with a sharp sound that seemed louder than thunder in the silent room. Angela gasped and quickly bent down to gather the pieces, whispering apologies. Richard turned sharply. His face hardened as he watched her crouch on the floor. He ended his call with a snap and stepped closer. His eyes narrowed, his voice sharp. "Do you know how much that glass cost?" he demanded. Angela kept her eyes lowered, stammering an apology, but before she could say more, he cut her off. "You're worthless trash," Richard said coldly. His words sliced through the air, each one landing with the weight of a stone. Angela froze. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had been insulted before, but never like this. His words sank deep, echoing in her mind. Worthless. Trash. She felt her cheeks burn with shame. The pieces of glass slipped from her trembling hands. Richard didn't stop to notice her pain, he turned away as if she were beneath his concern. His phone rang again, and he walked off, resuming his conversation, leaving her kneeling on the floor with tears stinging her eyes. Angela stayed there for a long moment. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. All these years, she had kept her head down, believing her hard work spoke for itself. All these years, she had endured being invisible, hoping that if she stayed quiet, she would be respected in some small way. But now she understood, in Richard's eyes, she was not even a person. She was disposable. She was nothing. That night, Angela finished her work in silence. She polished the silver until her hands ached, wiped down the marble counters until they gleamed, and swept away the shards of the broken glass. No one noticed her red eyes or the heaviness in her steps as she left the mansion. Outside, the night was cool, and the city lights glowed in the distance. She wrapped her sweater tighter around her shoulders and walked to the bus stop. On the ride home, her thoughts churned. She remembered her college days, when professors praised her sharp mind and classmates turned to her for help. She remembered how her father used to call her his bright star, believing she would one day rise higher than anyone in their family ever had. She remembered the books she still kept hidden under her bed, financial journals with highlighted notes scribbled in the margins. Was all of that truly worthless? The bus rattled through the dark streets, and Angela stared out of the window. She saw her reflection in the glass. For the first time, she didn't just see a maid in a simple uniform. She saw a woman who had once held big dreams, a woman who still had knowledge and strength locked deep inside her. Richard's insult burned in her chest, but alongside the pain, something new began to stir. By the time she reached her small apartment, Angela had made a silent vow. She would no longer allow herself to be treated like nothing. She might not have wealth, she might not have status, but she had intelligence, memory, and determination. Richard had mistaken her silence for weakness. He had no idea what she carried inside her mind. As Angela prepared for bed, she placed her worn finance textbooks on the table. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning charts, case studies, and notes she had once written years ago. Her heart pounded as if she were awakening a part of herself she had forgotten. That night, she barely slept. The insult still rang in her ears, but instead of breaking her, it lit a fire that she could no longer ignore. The next morning, Angela stood in front of the mirror before work. She put on her uniform as usual, but her eyes looked different. They carried a sharpness, a quiet resolve. She was still the maid who cleaned the billionaire's mansion, but inside, she was something else entirely. Richard Vaughn might have believed she was worthless, but soon, he would learn how wrong he was. The morning after Richard's harsh words, Angela woke up with a strange mix of pain and strength inside her. The memory of him calling her worthless still stung, but it also fueled her like a spark that refused to die out. She looked around her small apartment. The walls were plain, the furniture was second-hand, but on the wooden table near her bed lay the old finance books she had reopened the night before. The sight of them reminded her that she was more than what Richard thought. Angela tied her hair neatly, put on her maid's uniform, and left for work as usual. On the bus ride, she stared out at the city skyline. Towering glass buildings gleamed in the sunlight, representing power, money, and influence. Richard's name was attached to some of those towers. People admired him for his empire, but Angela now saw the truth more clearly. Behind the tall walls and shining glass was a man who thought he could crush others with words. She whispered to herself, "You don't know me yet." At the mansion, Angela performed her duties as quietly as ever. She dusted the shelves, changed the sheets, and polished the staircase rails until they shone. Richard barely noticed her. He was too busy rushing in and out, shouting orders over the phone, and meeting important guests. His schedule was a storm, and Angela, like always, was just a shadow moving in the background. Yet this time, she paid closer attention. She listened carefully when he spoke about business deals, when he scolded his managers, or when he bragged about his investments. She remembered how much she had loved finance in college. She had studied balance sheets, profit margins, and risks. Back then, she could look at numbers and see patterns others missed. Now, as she overheard Richard talking, she realized those same skills were still with her. She began to notice little things: a project he was excited about sounded too risky, a deal he bragged about seemed to have flaws, and his careless way of trusting only his closest circle of advisors left him blind to certain dangers. That evening, Angela stayed late to finish cleaning the library. She loved the library because it was filled with rows of leather-bound books. But more than that, Richard often left behind papers, reports, and magazines there. Most of the time, he dropped them on the desk and forgot about them. Angela carefully picked up one such report, her eyes scanning the words before she placed it neatly in a folder. It was about one of his companies and the challenges it faced. The words jumped out at her, and she quickly recognized weaknesses that Richard was ignoring. She felt her heart beat faster. For the first time in years, she felt like the student she once was, the one who could spot risks and solutions in a heartbeat. When she returned home, Angela wrote notes in an old notebook she had kept since college. Each page filled with observations from the mansion, things Richard said, documents she glimpsed, and patterns she noticed. It was almost like piecing together a puzzle. The more she wrote, the clearer the picture became. Richard's empire was not unshakable. In fact, it was fragile in ways even he didn't realize. Angela didn't tell anyone about her plan. She had learned long ago to keep her thoughts to herself. Her co-workers at the mansion often complained about Richard's temper or unfairness, but none of them ever imagined doing more than whispering about it in private. Angela, however, felt something growing inside her, a determination that wouldn't let her stay silent. One Sunday afternoon, Angela attended a community event in her neighborhood. It was a small gathering at the local center, where people shared food and stories. There, she ran into Daniel, a journalist she had met once before. He was friendly, curious, and always looking for stories that exposed truth. They struck up a conversation, and Daniel asked how she was doing. For a moment, Angela hesitated. She thought about keeping quiet. But then she remembered Richard's words echoing in her head, and her chest tightened. "I work for Richard Vaughan," she said softly. Daniel raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised. Everyone in the city knew the billionaire's name. Angela looked down and continued, "He isn't what people think he is. And his empire, it's not as solid as it looks." Daniel leaned forward, sensing the weight in her voice. "What do you mean?" he asked gently. Angela didn't reveal everything right away. She tested him with small pieces of information, bits she had overheard or documents she had remembered. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions, his pen moving quickly across his notebook. The more she spoke, the more Angela realized she was holding valuable knowledge that could shake the foundations of Richard's empire. When she finally stopped talking, Daniel looked at her with seriousness. "Angela, what you're telling me, this could be very important. But it's also dangerous. Are you sure you want to do this?" Angela thought of Richard's face, his cold eyes, and the insult he had thrown at her. She thought of the years she had spent being invisible, treated as if her existence meant nothing. Then she thought of her father's voice, calling her his bright star. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes. I'm sure." Over the next weeks, Angela and Daniel met secretly. Sometimes at the community center, sometimes in quiet cafes where no one knew her. Angela shared more notes, more details, and even managed to gather old financial magazines with Richard's interviews that hinted at his reckless decisions. Each time, she spoke carefully, making sure she remembered everything correctly. Daniel was amazed by her sharp mind. "You should have been running companies, not cleaning them," he said once. Angela smiled faintly but didn't reply. Back at the mansion, Angela continued her job as if nothing had changed. She polished floors, dusted vases, and served meals with a quiet expression. Richard barely looked at her, but she looked at him with new eyes. She saw the cracks in his confidence, the overconfidence in his smile, the blind pride in his words. And she knew that while he believed she was worthless, she was holding the knowledge that could change everything. Every night, Angela returned home exhausted but determined. She stayed up late, cross-checking the details in her notebook with articles she found online, piecing together the puzzle of Richard's empire. The more she worked, the clearer it became that Richard's power stood on weak ground. He had built tall towers, but their foundations were fragile. He believed no one could touch him. Angela knew better. By the time the month ended, Angela had transformed from a quiet maid into something else entirely. She was still invisible to Richard, but she had discovered a hidden strength inside herself. She carried her notebook like a weapon, each page filled with truth. She wasn't just reacting to his insult anymore, she was preparing for something much bigger. Angela sat by her small kitchen table one evening, the notebook open in front of her. The pages were filled with her neat handwriting, rows of notes, numbers, and reminders about Richard's business empire. Each line told a story of carelessness, arrogance, and risks hidden behind polished speeches. As she traced her finger along the lines, she felt something shift inside her. She was no longer just collecting information, she was preparing to use it. Her meetings with Daniel had grown more frequent. The journalist listened carefully, asked smart questions, and encouraged her when she doubted herself. He explained how stories like this could open people's eyes, how truth could create change. Angela often sat across from him, clutching her notebook tightly, her voice low but steady as she revealed more of what she knew. At first, she only told him small things, a careless comment she overheard, a financial report Richard had left on his desk, a deal he had bragged about at dinner. But as her confidence grew, she began to connect the dots and share larger patterns. Daniel was impressed by how quickly she could analyze information. "You're not just giving me clues," he said one night. "You're giving me the whole picture." Angela blushed faintly, unused to praise, but inside, her heart swelled with quiet pride. For years, she had hidden her abilities, convinced no one cared about her mind. Now someone was listening, and it reminded her of the young woman she once was, the one who had dreamed of working in finance, who had believed she could make a difference. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Richard continued his routines, completely unaware of the storm forming around him. He barked orders at his staff, boasted about his successes, and dismissed warnings from his advisors. Angela moved silently through the rooms, dusting shelves and arranging flowers, but behind her calm expression, her mind was sharp and calculating. She noticed every detail: the guests he entertained, the names mentioned in phone calls, the documents carelessly tossed aside. Nothing escaped her attention anymore. One afternoon, as she cleaned the study, Angela found a folder left open on the desk. The papers inside revealed a risky investment Richard was preparing to announce publicly. He was confident it would impress shareholders, but Angela quickly recognized the flaws. She memorized the key points and later wrote them down in her notebook. That evening, she shared the details with Daniel, who raised his eyebrows in disbelief. "If this is true, it could shake the market," he said. Angela nodded quietly. "It's true. I've seen enough to know he's hiding the risks. He thinks no one notices. But I notice." With every meeting, Angela grew bolder. She began to gather not just information, but also evidence. Sometimes she copied down phrases from documents, other times she recalled conversations word for word. Daniel, cautious and professional, kept her information safe and began building a careful plan for how to release it. Angela, though nervous, felt determined. She remembered the insult that had started it all: worthless trash, and knew that Richard had no idea how wrong he was. She wasn't worthless. She was powerful in her own quiet way, armed with knowledge and truth. Still, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the city outside her window was silent, Angela sometimes wondered if she was making a mistake. What if no one believed her? What if Richard found out and destroyed her life? The thought scared her, but then she remembered her father's words: "Bright stars are meant to shine, even in the darkest sky." She whispered those words to herself whenever fear tried to silence her. The turning point came one Friday evening when Richard hosted a lavish dinner party. Wealthy businessmen, politicians, and celebrities filled the grand hall. Angela moved quietly among them, serving drinks and tidying tables. She kept her head lowered, but her ears were open. Richard stood at the center, laughing loudly, boasting about his upcoming investment. He promised his guests that his empire would only grow stronger. Angela listened carefully, memorizing every promise he made. She knew it was reckless, a gamble that could collapse everything if exposed. Later that night, when the party ended and the mansion fell silent, Angela returned to the study and found a discarded paper napkin. On it, Richard had scribbled notes during the dinner, hints of the announcement he planned to make. Angela carefully smoothed the napkin, her hands steady, and tucked the details into her memory. The next day, she met Daniel at a quiet cafe. Her voice trembled slightly as she described the dinner and the napkin notes. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Angela," he said slowly, "what you've given me is enough to break the story wide open. This isn't just about carelessness anymore. This is about deception." Angela took a deep breath. "Then it's time," she whispered. From that moment, the plan moved quickly. Daniel and his editor prepared the article, double-checking every fact and cross-referencing Angela's notes with market data. They spoke with former employees who had long suspected corruption but had been too afraid to speak up. Angela's courage inspired others to come forward, and soon, the puzzle was complete. While all this was happening, Angela continued her work at the mansion as if nothing had changed. She dusted the chandeliers, ironed the curtains, and arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases. Richard barely looked at her. He had no idea that the maid walking silently through his grand halls was the very person preparing to reveal the truth that could destroy him. Angela felt a strange calm. She was nervous, of course her heart often raced when she thought of the storm about to break, but she also felt stronger than ever before. She was no longer the invisible maid who let insults pierce her without reply. She was a woman standing on the edge of change, ready to show the world that she mattered. The night before the article was set to go live, Angela sat by her window, watching the city lights. She thought about everything that had led her here, the years of silence, the endless hours of work, the humiliation of being treated as less than human. And then she thought of the moment Richard's empire would crumble, and she felt a quiet sense of justice. The morning the article went live began like any other. The city woke to the sound of traffic, newspapers hit doorsteps, and phones buzzed with notifications. But hidden inside those ordinary routines was something extraordinary. Daniel's story about Richard Vaughan, the billionaire with a golden reputation, had finally been published. The headline was bold, the words sharp, and the evidence undeniable. It spoke of reckless investments, hidden losses, and deals that put thousands of employees at risk. Angela sat in her small apartment, holding her old phone tightly in her hands. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the article. Every line carried pieces of information she had shared, every example carefully linked to evidence she had provided. She read it twice, then a third time, hardly believing that her quiet notes had turned into something so powerful. For years she had been invisible, but now her voice, hidden in Daniel's words, was reaching the whole world. At the same time, inside his towering office, Richard stormed into the building with his usual confidence. He greeted no one, already speaking into his phone as he rode the private elevator. But the moment he reached his desk, his assistant rushed in, pale and nervous. She held out a tablet. "Sir, you should see this." Richard frowned, snatched it from her hands, and began to read. As his eyes moved down the screen, his expression shifted. The confident smile disappeared, replaced by a deep scowl. His jaw tightened, his hands gripped the tablet so hard it nearly cracked. "Who did this?" he snapped, his voice sharp enough to make the assistant flinch. Within minutes, phones rang across his empire. Shareholders called, panicked. Business partners demanded explanations. News channels picked up the story, their voices echoing across television screens. Billionaire Richard Vaughan accused of hiding financial risks. Vaughan empire under scrutiny. Angela's bus ride to work that morning felt different. People around her were talking about the story, their voices filled with shock. Some shook their heads, others laughed bitterly, saying they had always suspected something. Angela sat quietly, staring out the window, but inside her chest, her heart pounded with pride and fear all at once. When she arrived at the mansion, the atmosphere had changed. Staff whispered nervously in the hallways. Security guards walked briskly, their faces tense. Richard was locked in his study, making furious phone calls. Angela moved silently through the rooms, carrying out her duties, but her ears caught fragments of his rage. Find out who leaked this. They can't prove anything. Fix it now. But fixing it was impossible. The story spread faster than wildfire. By noon, television vans lined the street outside his office building. Reporters shouted questions as Richard's black car pulled into the garage. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched forward, and voices filled the air. Mr. Vaughn, is it true you misled investors? Mr. Vaughn, are you facing legal action? Richard pushed past them without a word, but the world had already seen his silence. Angela returned home that evening to find the news playing on every channel. She watched as experts debated the future of Richard's empire. Some said it could recover if he explained everything quickly, but most believed the damage was already too great. Stock prices began to fall, and videos of panicked shareholders filled the internet. For the first time in her life, Angela felt the weight of her own power. She had done this not out of revenge, but out of truth. She had carried knowledge in silence, and now that silence had been broken, the consequences were shaking the city. The days that followed were chaos. Every morning brought new headlines: government investigates Vaughn Enterprises. Major partners withdraw support. Stock value drops another 15%. Angela watched it all unfold with steady eyes. Richard, who had once called her worthless, was now the subject of ridicule. Newspapers printed cartoons mocking him. Television hosts spoke of his arrogance. Employees who had feared him now spoke out against him. The empire he had built over decades was crumbling, piece by piece. Inside the mansion, the change was visible. The once busy halls grew quieter as staff members left, unsure if they would still be paid. Meetings were cancelled, guests stopped visiting, and the laughter of parties faded into silence. Richard's face grew harder each day, his voice more desperate. Angela often passed by his study and heard him shouting on the phone, but she no longer felt small in his presence. She felt calm, as though she were watching a storm she already knew would break. One evening, Angela walked through the library, the room where she had once found his discarded papers. She paused by the desk, remembering the day he had called her worthless. The memory still hurt, but now it felt distant, like a shadow fading in the light. She realized that his insult had been the spark that pushed her to rediscover her own strength. Without that moment, she might never have opened her notebooks again, never have spoken to Daniel, never have believed in herself. Meanwhile, Richard's world collapsed around him. Banks pulled their support. His board of directors resigned one by one. Investigators raided his offices, carrying boxes of documents into waiting vans. The sight was broadcast across the city, images of men in suits walking out with evidence while cameras flashed. Angela sat in her apartment that night, watching the news quietly. She sipped tea as the anchor announced, Richard Vaughn's $2.4 billion empire has lost nearly half its value in just 1 week. Her lips curved into the smallest smile. It wasn't joy at another man's downfall. It was relief, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had finally been seen. In the days that followed, Angela went about her life as usual. She still wore her maid's uniform, still rode the bus, still swept floors and polished silver. But inside, she was different. She carried herself taller, her eyes brighter, her heart stronger. No one knew it was her who had helped bring the truth to light, and she was fine with that. She didn't need the world's recognition. She only needed to know that she had proven Richard wrong. At the mansion, Richard barely appeared anymore. Rumors spread that he was staying locked in his office or meeting with lawyers. His once proud figure seemed smaller now, weighed down by the collapse of everything he had built. Staff whispered about finding new jobs, sensing the end was near. Angela watched it all in silence, her hands steady as she folded sheets or wiped down tables. The man who had thought she was nothing was now powerless, and she, quiet, invisible Angela, had become the unseen force that changed everything. That night, as she stood by her window looking out at the glowing city, Angela whispered softly, "You thought I was worthless. But now you know the truth." Weeks passed, and the storm around Richard Vaughan grew heavier until his empire could no longer stand. Newspapers announced his resignation from his own company, investors pulled out, and government agencies froze several of his accounts. The man who once ruled boardrooms with confidence now avoided cameras and closed himself inside his mansion. Where there had once been banquets, laughter, and bright lights, there was now silence and emptiness. Angela still came to work each day, but she felt the change in every step. Staff had been reduced, paychecks were delayed, and the mansion no longer felt alive. Richard barely appeared. Sometimes she caught a glimpse of him walking quickly through the hall, his shoulders hunched, his face pale. The man who had once called her worthless no longer looked powerful. He looked defeated. Angela, on the other hand, had discovered something new within herself. She no longer carried her head low when she cleaned. She stood straighter, her movements calm but firm. No one around her knew the role she had played in exposing Richard's empire, and she never spoke of it. She did not need recognition. The knowledge itself was enough to give her peace. One evening, as she walked home from work, Angela stopped by a small bookstore. On the shelves, she noticed fresh editions of financial journals, the very ones she used to love reading during her college days. She bought one, carrying it home in her bag. That night, she sat by her table with her notebook, flipping through the pages with focus. The joy of learning returned to her, stronger than ever. Not long after, Daniel reached out to her again. His article had won awards, and his career had soared, but he never forgot Angela. They met in a quiet cafe, the same way they had before. Daniel looked at her with respect and gratitude. "Angela," he said, "you changed everything. You gave people the courage to speak. You gave truth to the world." Angela smiled softly. "I just did what I had to do." Daniel leaned forward. "Have you thought about what comes next for you? You're too smart, too capable, to spend the rest of your life cleaning rooms in silence. You should finish what you started. Go back to school. Use your mind the way it was meant to be used." His words stayed with her long after their meeting. That night, Angela thought of her father, of how proud he had always been of her. She thought of the young woman she once was, sitting in classrooms, solving problems, raising her hand with answers. And she thought of the moment Richard had insulted her, the moment that pushed her to remember who she truly was. Slowly, Angela began to make changes. She applied for a scholarship program designed for adults returning to education. She sent in her old transcripts, explained her unfinished studies, and waited nervously for a reply. Weeks later, when she received an acceptance letter, tears filled her eyes. She held the paper against her chest, whispering, "I did it." Angela balanced her days between work and classes at first. She attended lectures, carried heavy books, and sat among younger students, but she never felt out of place. Her professors admired her dedication, and her classmates respected her quiet intelligence. She began to thrive again, her old confidence returning. She was no longer just a maid, she was a student, a learner, a woman rebuilding her life. At the same time, Richard's empire continued to sink. News channels reported his bankruptcy. Properties were sold, assets were seized, and the once famous billionaire disappeared from public life. Angela heard whispers that he had left the city altogether, retreating from the spotlight he once loved. She felt no hatred toward him anymore, only a quiet sense of closure. His words had once cut her deeply, but now they no longer held power. With her scholarship, Angela soon left the mansion job behind. On her last day, she walked through the halls one final time, remembering all the years she had spent cleaning, dusting, and enduring silence. She placed her uniform neatly in the laundry basket and walked out with her head high. The sky outside was wide and bright, and for the first time, she felt completely free. As the months turned into years, Angela achieved more than she had ever imagined. She finished her degree, graduating with honors. She was offered a position at a financial firm, where her sharp mind and keen eye for detail impressed her supervisors. But Angela did not stop there. She remembered her own struggles, the sacrifices her family had made, and the pain of being dismissed as nothing. She wanted to help others like her, people who were overlooked but filled with potential. So Angela started a small foundation. At first, it provided scholarships for workers who wanted to return to school. Later, it grew into a program that offered mentoring, financial guidance, and support for families in need. Angela poured her heart into it, remembering every moment of her own journey. She wanted to give others the chance to rise, no matter where they started. The community began to recognize her work. People who once saw her as invisible now saw her as a leader, a voice of hope. She spoke at events, sharing her story in simple words, inspiring others to believe in themselves. Every time she stood before a crowd, she thought of her father's words, "Bright stars are meant to shine." She knew now that he had been right all along. Angela never sought revenge. What she wanted was dignity, respect, and the chance to live fully. Richard's insult had once made her feel like nothing, but in the end, it had pushed her to discover everything she truly was. She had destroyed his empire, yes, but more importantly, she had built her own life, a life filled with purpose, learning, and light. On a quiet evening, years later, Angela sat by her window once again, the city glowing outside. Her foundation had helped hundreds of people, her career was thriving, and her heart was at peace. She opened her old notebook, the one filled with the first notes she had taken in Richard's mansion. The pages were worn, the ink faded, but she smiled as she read them. Those words had been the start of her transformation. She closed the notebook gently and whispered, "I was never worthless. I was always more." And with that, Angela leaned back, her eyes shining. The maid who had once been invisible was now a woman of strength, intelligence, and compassion. She had not only survived Richard Vaughn's cruelty, she had risen above it, proving to herself and to the world that no one could define her worth but he.